The air in the hospital felt thick with tension, and I could feel it pressing down on my chest as I entered the ward. The familiar sounds of machines beeping and the faint murmur of voices created a strange kind of background noise, one that I had grown used to over the years. But today, it seemed louder, more insistent. Maybe it was because of her, Mrs. Lebedev. She was the kind of patient you don't easily forget. Thin and fragile, her skin almost translucent against the stark white sheets, with each breath a laborious effort. Her family hadn't visited in days, and there was something deeply unsettling about her being alone, hovering between life and death. As I checked her vitals, I couldn't shake the worry gnawing at the back of my mind. Something wasn't right. The doctors had been cryptic during their last rounds, their tone more resigned than I was comfortable with. The words, "prepare for the worst," had been whispered as if her fate had already been sealed. It wasn't just the acceptance of death. They seemed almost eager to move on, as if her passing would make things easier. I adjusted the sheets and smoothed her hair back gently. "You're not going anywhere today, Mrs. Lebedev," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to comfort her or convince myself. Just then, Dr. Ivanov walked in, clipboard in hand, his expression indifferent. He was one of those doctors who treated patients like numbers, each life reduced to data points on a chart. "Vitals steady for now," he muttered, not even looking at her directly. "Steady, yes," I said, hesitating before adding, "but she's still fighting. Maybe we should try adjusting the treatment?" He gave me a sidelong glance, a hint of annoyance in his voice. "Ava, sometimes fighting just prolongs suffering. You can see she's at the end." "But we shouldn't give up," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. "She's still here." Dr. Ivanov sighed, scribbling something on the chart. "The family has already been informed of her condition. We've done everything we can. The priority now is comfort, not prolongation." I felt a pang of frustration. Comfort doesn't mean we stop trying. He paused, looking at me with a detached expression. "You're a good nurse, Ava, but you need to understand that sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do is let go." With that, he left, leaving me standing by Mrs. Lebedev's bedside, the weight of his words settling over me. But I couldn't let it go, not yet. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself checking in on her more frequently than usual. Something about the way Dr. Ivanov spoke bothered me. His words sounded like someone who had already given up, not just on Mrs. Lebedev, but on the idea that she was more than just a case file. An hour later, during a quick break in the staff lounge, I couldn't help but bring it up with Elena, a fellow nurse who had been here almost as long as I had. "Elena, do you ever feel like they're too quick to give up sometimes?" She looked up from her cup of coffee, raising an eyebrow. "You mean with Lebedev?" I nodded. She leaned back, sighing. "It's not easy, Ava. We see so much death here. You can't save everyone, and sometimes the doctors, well, they get numb. You have to, otherwise it eats at you." "I know that," I said softly, staring at the floor. "But this feels different. Like they've already decided she's gone." "She's old, she's frail, and her family's barely involved," Elena said bluntly. "To them, it's just a matter of time." I frowned, feeling a tightness in my chest. "But she's still here, Elena. She's still breathing. Doesn't that mean something?" "It does to you, and that's what makes you a good nurse," she sighed, putting her cup down and giving me a sympathetic smile. "But you have to protect yourself too, Ava. You can't carry every patient's burden." "I just can't stop thinking that we're missing something," I whispered. Elena gave me a long look, but didn't respond. We both knew the unspoken truth. We couldn't save everyone. But for Mrs. Lebedev, I wasn't ready to accept that yet. Not today. It had been an exhausting morning. The usual rounds, the meticulous cleaning, and the constant attention to detail that my colleagues sometimes teased me about, it all felt heavier today. Mrs. Lebedev's condition weighed on me like a storm cloud I couldn't shake. But what happened next would stir something even darker inside me. I was cleaning the floor near the staff break room, the rhythmic motion of the mop almost meditative, when I heard muffled voices from behind the thin wall. It was Dr. Ivanov and Nurse Clara. They spoke in low tones, just quiet enough to suggest they didn't want to be overheard. But I was standing close enough to catch fragments of their conversation. "She's not going to last much longer," Dr. Ivanov said. His voice was flat, clinical. "That's what I've been saying," Nurse Clara responded. "It's better this way. The family, they can't do anything for her, and frankly, it's just a matter of time." I paused, leaning closer to the wall without making a sound. My heart began to race, though I didn't fully understand why. "Has anyone spoken to her family recently?" Dr. Ivanov asked. "No," Clara replied, her tone indifferent. "No need. They barely visit, and it's better they stay away. No point in giving them hope when there's none left." I froze, a strange chill running down my spine. Keeping the family away, I frowned, gripping the handle of the mop tightly. I knew Mrs. Lebedev's family hadn't been around much, but to deliberately keep them in the dark. Something about the way they were talking, it felt wrong. Dr. Ivanov's voice dropped lower. "We'll make sure she's comfortable, but the sooner it's over, the better." My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They weren't just talking about care. They were talking about the end as if it were inevitable, as if they had control over it. And the family, did they even know how bad things had become? I hurriedly moved the mop back and forth, trying to act normal as the door to the break room creaked open. Nurse Clara stepped out, her eyes skimming the hallway. When she saw me, she raised an eyebrow. "Ava," she said, almost too casually, "you're always cleaning this part of the floor, aren't you?" I forced a smile, hoping my face didn't give away what I had overheard. "Just making sure everything's spotless." She gave me a smirk. "No wonder your patients love you. You're always so thorough." She glanced back at the break room and lowered her voice. "But you know, sometimes it's better not to care so much. You'll burn out. We all do." I nodded but said nothing. I wasn't sure how to respond without raising suspicion. She walked off, and I continued cleaning, my mind racing with questions. Why were they so intent on keeping the family away? Was something else going on that I didn't know about? Later that day, I found myself in the break room with Elena again. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I had to tell someone what I'd overheard. "Elena, something strange is going on with Mrs. Lebedev." I started, my voice hushed even though we were alone. "I overheard Dr. Ivanov and Clara talking. They're keeping her family away on purpose, and it sounded like they're not doing everything they can." Elena looked up from her tea, her eyes narrowing. "What exactly did you hear?" I hesitated, replaying the conversation in my mind. "They said it's better this way, that the family doesn't need to know everything because it's just a matter of time." Elena frowned, setting her cup down. "That doesn't sound right." "No, it doesn't," I agreed, my voice shaking slightly. "They're acting like they've already given up on her, and they're deliberately keeping the family at a distance. Doesn't that seem suspicious to you?" Elena leaned back in her chair, considering my words. "I've worked with Ivanov before. He's not exactly known for being compassionate, but this is off. I feel like they're hiding something," I said, my mind racing with possibilities. "Maybe they're covering up a mistake, or worse." Elena glanced around the room, making sure no one else was listening. "Ava, if you think something's wrong, you need to be careful. If Ivanov and Clara are up to something, you poking around could put you in a bad spot." "I know," I said, my heart pounding in my chest, "but I can't just ignore it. Mrs. Lebedev deserves better than this." Elena sighed, rubbing her temples. "I get it. I do, but tread carefully. If there's something going on, you're not going to be able to fix it on your own." I nodded, though my mind was already made up. I couldn't just let it go, not after hearing what I did. Something wasn't right, and I needed to find out what. The next day was one of those long shifts where the hours blurred together. Most of the other nurses handled their rounds with brisk efficiency, moving quickly from patient to patient, but I always took my time, especially with Mrs. Lebedev. There was something about her frail figure lying in the hospital bed, her shallow breaths the only indication she was still holding on, that made me feel responsible for her in a way I couldn't quite explain. As I entered her room, the quiet hum of the medical machines filled the air. I adjusted her blankets and checked her vitals with the usual precision that had earned me both admiration and teasing from my colleagues. To some, I was too meticulous, but I didn't mind. I knew it was what made me a good nurse. "You're still with us," I whispered gently as I brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. She didn't respond, but there was a calmness to her face that hadn't been there yesterday. I didn't know what to make of it, but I liked to think she could feel the care I put into looking after her. As I worked, I could hear faint laughter from the hallway. The other nurses were probably exchanging stories, taking a moment to breathe between rounds. But I wasn't like them. I didn't breeze through my duties just to get to the end of my shift. After finishing with Mrs. Lebedev, I moved on to cleaning the floor around her bed. I couldn't help but remember the conversation I had overheard the day before between Dr. Ivanov and Nurse Clara. Their callous attitudes still gnawed at me, but I knew I had to focus. There's a time and place for everything, I reminded myself. Right now, my job was to give Mrs. Lebedev the best care I could. Later, as I was organizing supplies in the nurses' station, Nurse Clara strolled in with her usual swagger. She was the type who didn't believe in giving more than the bare minimum, but she always had something to say about those who did. Still fussing over Lebedev, she asked with a smirk, her tone light but with an undercurrent of judgment. I didn't look up from the clipboard I was reviewing. "She's still my patient, Clara." Clara chuckled, leaning against the counter. "You're too serious sometimes, Ava. You're acting like the woman's going to thank you for it." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "I don't need her thanks. I just need to know I'm doing everything I can for her." "That's the problem with you," Clara said, shaking her head. "You care too much. You'll burn out before you hit 30 if you keep up this pace." I finally looked up at her, meeting her gaze. "Maybe, but if I burn out, at least I'll know I did my job right." Clara raised an eyebrow, her expression softening slightly. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I do," I said, my voice firm. "I became a nurse to take care of people, not to cut corners." She shrugged, pushing off the counter. "Well, good luck with that. Just don't say I didn't warn you when you're the one pulling double shifts and wondering why no one else is trying as hard as you." With that, she left, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. I watched her go, a strange mixture of frustration and sadness settling in my chest. Clara was a good nurse in her own way, but we saw things differently. To her, patients were just part of the job, but to me, they were more. They were people, deserving of dignity and respect, no matter how sick they were. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. Dr. Ivanov had been in and out of Mrs. Lebedev's room several times, his expression unreadable as he studied her chart. Each time he left, I felt a little more anxious, as if he were waiting for something to happen. Or was he hoping for something to happen? The thought chilled me. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave for the day, I found myself standing by Mrs. Lebedev's bedside once more. Her breathing was slow but steady, her eyes half closed as if she were hovering between wakefulness and sleep. "You're still fighting," I whispered. "I hope it's worth it." As I turned to go, I heard the faintest sound, a soft, almost inaudible word escaping from her lips. "Thank you." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I turned back to her, leaning in closer to make sure I hadn't imagined it. But her eyes were still closed, her face peaceful, her breathing unchanged. Had I really heard her voice, or was it just wishful thinking? As I made my way to the exit, I passed by Nurse Alina, who was finishing up her own shift. She gave me a knowing look. "Still spending extra time with Lebedev?" she asked. I nodded, sighing. I can't help it. She's hanging on by a thread, and I feel like I'm the only one who cares." Alina smiled gently. "That's why you're one of the good ones, Ava. But don't forget to take care of yourself too. You can't save everyone." "I know," I replied quietly, "but I'm not giving up on her yet." Alina nodded, her expression softening. "Just don't carry it all on your shoulders. We're in this together, remember?" I smiled, appreciating her words, even though I knew deep down that my dedication to Mrs. Lebedev was personal. There was something about this case, something about the way her care was being handled, that I couldn't let go, and I wasn't about to stop until I figured out what it was. The following day, the hospital seemed quieter than usual. The usual hum of activity, nurses rushing from one room to the next, doctors discussing cases in hushed tones, patients' families chatting in the hallways, was muted. It was as if the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for something. I made my way through my rounds, checking in on the patients, performing routine tasks, and trying to keep my mind from wandering back to Mrs. Lebedev. Despite everything I had overheard and the troubling thoughts it stirred in me, today felt different. There was a strange calmness in the air, a stillness that made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite place why. When I entered Mrs. Lebedev's room, I was surprised to find her lying peacefully, her expression serene. She had been restless and agitated in previous days, but now she seemed calm, almost as if she had found some sort of inner peace. I stood at the foot of her bed, watching her for a moment, letting the silence of the room envelop me. Her breathing was slow and steady, each rise and fall of her chest a gentle reminder that she was still here, still holding on. I walked to her bedside and gently touched her hand. It was warm, softer than I expected. "Mrs. Lebedev," I whispered, though I wasn't sure she could hear me. "You seem calmer today. I hope that means you're feeling more comfortable." There was no response, but I didn't need one. Her calmness was enough. It was as if the tension that had hung over her in the past few days had lifted, at least for now. As I continued with my tasks, Nurse Elena walked into the room, her expression thoughtful. "How is she today?" she asked, glancing at Mrs. Lebedev. "Better, I think," I replied, looking down at the frail woman in the bed. "She seems peaceful, calmer than she's been in days." Alina nodded, stepping closer to the bedside. "It's strange, isn't it, how they can go from being so restless to so calm, almost like they know something we don't." I smiled softly. "I think they do. There's a part of them that understands more than we realize." Alina sighed, folding her arms across her chest. "You know, I've seen this kind of thing before. It usually happens when they've made peace with something, or when they're close to the end. It's like they're letting go." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't want to think about Mrs. Lebedev's time running out, not when I still had so many questions, so many suspicions about what was going on with her care. But I couldn't deny the truth in Alina's observation. I had seen it too, patients who found a strange sense of peace right before they slipped away. "Do you think it's time?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Alina glanced at me, her expression soft. "It's hard to say, but if she's calm now, that's what matters. We just have to make sure she's comfortable." I nodded, knowing she was right. Even with all the doubts and suspicions clouding my mind, Mrs. Lebedev's comfort was the priority. It was all I could control in a situation that felt increasingly out of my hands. After Alina left the room, I sat down in the chair by the window, taking a rare moment to breathe. The view outside was a small patch of greenery, a few trees swaying gently in the breeze. It was a peaceful sight, a sharp contrast to the stress and uncertainty that had been building inside me. As I sat there, a soft voice broke the silence. "Ava." I turned quickly, surprised to hear my name. Mrs. Lebedev's eyes were open, her gaze focused on me. It was the first time in days that she had looked so alert, so present. "Mrs. Lebedev," I said softly, leaning closer to her. She smiled faintly, her eyes glassy but filled with a warmth I hadn't seen before. "You've been kind to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I felt a lump form in my throat. "I'm just doing my job," I replied, though her words touched me deeply. "No," she said, her hand moving slightly in mine. "More than that, you care." I swallowed hard, not knowing how to respond. There was a part of me that wanted to tell her everything about the conversations I had overheard, my suspicions, my fears that something was wrong. But this moment wasn't about me. It was about her, and I didn't want to take that away from her. "Thank you," she whispered again, her grip on my hand weak but steady. I smiled, blinking away the moisture that had gathered in my eyes. "You're welcome, Mrs. Lebedev." She closed her eyes again, her breathing even and calm. I stayed with her for a few more minutes, letting the quiet of the room wash over me, the weight of her gratitude settling gently in my chest. As I left her room, I ran into Dr. Ivanov in the hallway. He glanced at me with his usual cold indifference, but something about his posture seemed tense. "How's Lebedev?" he asked, his tone clipped. "She's calm today," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "More peaceful than she's been in days." He nodded curtly. "Good. We'll keep an eye on her." Without another word, he turned and walked away. I watched him go, my suspicions flaring up again. "What are you hiding, Dr. Ivanov?" The thought nagged at me, but there was nothing I could do at the moment. For now, Mrs. Lebedev was calm, and that was all that mattered. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital feeling an unusual weight in the air. There was a tension that I couldn't shake, like something was about to happen but hadn't yet shown its face. As I made my way down the familiar corridors, I passed a few colleagues who offered polite greetings, though their faces were more serious than usual. Something was off. When I reached Mrs. Lebedev's room, I found the door slightly ajar, which was odd. The room was usually kept closed to maintain her privacy and to control the flow of visitors, even if there were rarely any. My gut twisted with unease as I pushed the door open slowly. The sight that greeted me made my stomach drop. Mrs. Lebedev lay on the bed, her frail body appearing even weaker than it had the day before. Her skin, which had been pale but calm, was now sallow and lifeless. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, but something was wrong, very wrong. I approached the bed, my heart pounding. Her pulse was faint, barely detectable. Her breathing, once steady, had become erratic. I checked the monitors. Her vital signs had plummeted overnight. "Mrs. Lebedev," I whispered, leaning closer, "can you hear me?" There was no response. I gently touched her hand, but it was cold, unnaturally so. A wave of dread washed over me. This isn't right. She had been stable just yesterday, calmer than she had been in days. How had things deteriorated so quickly? I heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching from behind. I turned to see Dr. Ivanov entering the room, his expression grim. He glanced at the monitors and then at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What happened?" I asked, my voice laced with concern. Dr. Ivanov stepped closer, his gaze flicking between Mrs. Lebedev and the machines. "Her condition worsened overnight," he said, his tone flat, almost rehearsed. "It's not uncommon in cases like hers." I frowned, feeling a surge of frustration. "But she was stable yesterday. This doesn't make sense." He shrugged, the gesture too casual for the gravity of the situation. "These things happen, Ava. Patients like Mrs. Lebedev, sometimes they take a turn for the worse without any clear warning." His words did little to calm my unease. Something about his demeanor felt off, like he was holding something back. My mind raced, replaying the events of the past few days. The conversation I overheard between Dr. Ivanov and Nurse Clara, the notary's visit, and now this sudden deterioration. As Dr. Ivanov checked her chart, I couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that something was being hidden from me. I watched him closely, searching for any sign that he knew more than he was letting on. "Has anyone spoken to her family?" I asked, my voice tight. "They should know what's happening." Dr. Ivanov glanced up from the chart, his expression carefully neutral. "There's no need to involve them right now," he said smoothly. "We'll inform them if her condition worsens further." I clenched my jaw. If she was already at death's door, and he was talking about if her condition worsened? I opened my mouth to argue, but a sudden knock at the door interrupted us. Nurse Alina stepped in, her eyes darting between me and Dr. Ivanov. "There's someone asking for you in the hall, Ava," she said, her voice quiet. "He said it's urgent." I blinked, surprised. "For me?" Alina nodded, her expression tense. "Yes, he said it was a legal matter." My heart skipped a beat. Legal matter? Why would anyone be asking for me regarding something legal? I exchanged a quick glance with Dr. Ivanov, whose face had become an unreadable mask. "I'll be back in a moment," I said, stepping away from the bed and moving towards the door. As I passed Alina, she gave me a worried look, as if sensing the same unease I felt. I walked down the hallway, my mind racing with possibilities. In the corridor, I spotted a man in a dark suit standing near the nurse's station. He looked out of place in the sterile environment of the hospital, like he belonged in a boardroom, not a medical facility. As I approached him, he turned towards me, his expression professional but serious. "Are you Ava?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. I nodded, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "Yes, I am. Can I help you?" The man gave a small nod. "My name is Viktor Novikov. I'm a notary." A notary? I felt my pulse quicken. The pieces began to fall into place. The conversation I overheard, the sudden presence of a notary at the hospital, Mrs. Lebedev's rapid decline. Something wasn't right. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm here to oversee the execution of Mrs. Lebedev's will," Viktor said, his tone businesslike. "She requested my presence as her legal affairs are being settled." I blinked, taken aback. Her will? But she hasn't passed yet. He nodded again, but his expression remained cool. It's not uncommon for these matters to be prepared in advance. However, I was informed that her condition had worsened, which is why I'm here today. My mind reeled. Was that what this was all about? Had someone been waiting for her to decline just to settle her affairs? It felt wrong, deeply wrong, but I had no proof. All I had were suspicions and the unsettling feeling that something unethical was happening right under my nose. I didn't know about this, I stammered, trying to process what was unfolding. Viktor gave me a small, almost pitying smile. It's not unusual for the medical staff to be unaware of the legal arrangements. Before I could respond, I saw Dr. Ivanov walking towards us, his expression unreadable. He approached Viktor with a curt nod. "Is everything in order?" Dr. Ivanov asked, his voice calm, as if this was just another routine day. Viktor nodded. "Yes, I'll be speaking with the necessary parties shortly." I watched them, my unease growing with every second. Why hadn't the family been contacted? Why had the notary been called in now, of all times? My heart raced as the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about Mrs. Lebedev's health anymore. There was something much larger at play, something I needed to understand before it was too late. The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. It felt less like a request and more like a warning. Alina shifted uncomfortably beside me, clearly picking up on the tension. "Of course, doctor," I replied, forcing a smile. Dr. Ivanov nodded again before turning and leaving the room, the door closing softly behind him. As soon as he was gone, Alina let out a breath she'd been holding. "Did you hear that? He knows we're suspicious." I nodded, my mind racing. "We need to be careful. He's watching us." The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks, but my thoughts never strayed far from the unsettling discovery. By the time my shift ended, I felt drained, emotionally and physically. I headed to the staff lounge, hoping for a few moments of quiet before going home. But as I entered, I found Nurse Clara sitting at the table, sipping a cup of coffee. She looked up at me with a small, knowing smile. "Ava," she said casually, though there was something unnerving in her tone. "You've been working hard today, haven't you?" I forced a polite smile, trying to maintain my composure. "Just doing my job." Clara nodded, taking another sip. "You're very thorough. It's admirable. But sometimes, you have to learn when to let go. Not everything can be saved, you know." Her words struck a nerve. There was something pointed in her tone, as if she was telling me to back off. I wasn't imagining it. There was definitely something wrong. "I don't give up on my patients," I replied firmly, meeting her gaze. "Mrs. Lebedev deserves the best care we can give her." Clara's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course she does. But some things are beyond our control, Ava. Don't overwork yourself trying to fix what's already broken." I clenched my jaw, refusing to rise to her bait. "I'll keep doing my best for her. She deserves that much." Clara shrugged, standing up and heading toward the door. "Just be careful. Sometimes caring too much can be dangerous." As she left, her words echoed in my mind. Caring too much can be dangerous. Was that a threat? A warning? My heart pounded as I realized that whatever was happening with Mrs. Lebedev wasn't just a series of unfortunate events. It was deliberate, and I was getting too close to the truth. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every conversation, every strange interaction played over in my mind. Dr. Ivanov's cold demeanor, Clara's cryptic comments, and the notary's presence. Everything pointed to something dark lurking beneath the surface. I had reached the breaking point. I couldn't stand by any longer. Tomorrow, I would confront Dr. Ivanov, no matter the risk. I had to find out what was happening to Mrs. Lebedev before it was too late. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital with a heavy sense of purpose. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind was racing with all the questions I needed answered. Mrs. Lebedev's life was slipping away, and I couldn't stand by any longer, unsure if I was watching a natural decline or something far more sinister. Today, I would confront Dr. Ivanov. The hallways felt colder than usual, the sterile smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. Every step echoed, as if amplifying my growing unease. I knew I was taking a risk. Going up against Dr. Ivanov meant challenging the most powerful figure in the hospital, someone who controlled every aspect of patient care. But I had no choice. The pieces weren't adding up. As I approached the nurse's station, Elena was already there, busy with paperwork. She looked up and caught my eye, her face a mix of concern and curiosity. "Are you really going to do it?" she asked quietly, leaning closer. "Confront Ivanov." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I don't think I have a choice. Something's happening with Mrs. Lebedev, and we both know it's not right. If I don't do this, who will?" Elena glanced around nervously, then lowered her voice even more. "Be careful, Ava. Ivanov doesn't like being questioned. And Nurse Clara, she's been unusually close to him these days. Whatever they're hiding, they're in it together." "I know," I said, feeling a surge of determination, "but I can't let that stop me." Leaving Elena behind, I made my way to Dr. Ivanov's office. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to feel, as if the very walls were pressing in on me. By the time I stood in front of his door, my hands were trembling. But I couldn't back down now. I knocked twice, and after a moment, his deep voice called out, "Come in." Steeling myself, I opened the door and stepped inside. Dr. Ivanov was seated behind his large, imposing desk, paperwork scattered across the surface. He looked up, his expression unreadable, though his eyes seemed to narrow slightly when he saw it was me. "Ava," he said, his tone even. "What brings you here? I'm sure you're busy with your rounds." I took a deep breath, standing tall. "I need to talk to you about Mrs. Lebedev." His eyes flickered with something. Surprise, perhaps? Annoyance? But he quickly masked it with his usual cold composure. "What about her? I've already reviewed her case." "That's exactly the problem," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've been noticing things. The notary's visits, the conversations you've been having with the other staff about keeping her family away. And her condition, it's deteriorating too fast. Dr. Ivanov leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. Ava, I understand that you're concerned, but you must remember that I'm the one responsible for making these decisions. You don't have the full picture. His dismissive tone only fueled my anger. I don't need the full picture to see that something's wrong. You're not telling me everything. Why hasn't her family been notified? Why was a notary here when she's not even stable? This isn't how we're supposed to treat our patients. Ivanov's expression darkened, his gaze turning icy. You're overstepping, Ava. I suggest you be careful with your accusations. Mrs. Lebedev's situation is complicated, and not everything is as black and white as you seem to think. I'm not making accusations, I said, my voice firm. But I've been a nurse long enough to know when something feels wrong. If there's a reason you're keeping her family away, if there's a reason you're pushing certain decisions, I deserve to know. For a moment, silence hung between us, thick and heavy. Then, Ivanov's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. You're a good nurse, Ava. Too good, perhaps, he said slowly, his words dripping with condescension. But you're also naive. There are things that happen in hospitals, decisions that have to be made, that you might not understand. It's not your place to question them. My chest tightened, fury bubbling beneath the surface. If it's about Mrs. Lebedev's care, then it is my place. She deserves more than whatever you're doing to her. Ivanov stood up suddenly, the force of his movement startling me. He walked around the desk, towering over me as he spoke in a low, threatening voice. You need to stop, Ava. Walk away from this, or you'll find yourself in over your head. I've seen nurses like you before, idealistic, thinking they can change the system. But in the end, they always get crushed. I stood my ground, meeting his gaze despite the fear creeping up my spine. I'm not going to stop. If you won't tell me the truth, I'll find it myself. Ivanov's eyes flashed with anger, but before he could respond, the door swung open. Nurse Clara stepped inside, her face twisted in an almost amused smile. Well, well, she said, her voice dripping with mockery. Looks like we have a little rebellion on our hands. I glared at her, feeling the hostility radiating from her presence. This isn't about rebellion, Clara. It's about doing the right thing. Clara chuckled, shaking her head. Oh, Ava, always so self-righteous. You really think you can go against us? You don't know how deep this goes. The room seemed to close in around me as I realized just how outnumbered I was. Ivanov and Clara stood united, their secrets tightly guarded. But I couldn't back down now, not when Mrs. Lebedev's life was at stake. I'm not afraid of you, I said, my voice shaking but resolute. I'll do whatever it takes to protect my patients. Ivanov's face hardened, and he stepped closer, his voice a menacing whisper. You've been warned, Ava. If you keep pushing, you'll regret it. With that, he turned away, walking back to his desk as if the conversation was over. Clara gave me one last, lingering look before following him, the door clicking shut behind her. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing, the weight of their threats pressing down on me. But despite the fear gnawing at my insides, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to stop. The tension from my confrontation with Dr. Ivanov lingered, but it only sharpened my resolve. I could feel the weight of what I was up against, an entire system built on secrecy, where those in power could manipulate the lives of the vulnerable. Mrs. Lebedev was hanging by a thread, and I knew the truth behind her situation wasn't just a medical issue anymore. It was something darker. That evening, as the hospital corridors quieted and the bustling noise of the day began to fade, I returned to the ward. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving only a skeleton crew behind. The night shift was always quieter, but tonight it felt eerie, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I approached Mrs. Lebedev's room, my footsteps soft on the polished floor. The door was slightly ajar, just as I had left it earlier, I peeked inside, half expecting to find Nurse Clara or one of the other senior staff members lingering around, but the room was empty. Mrs. Lebedev lay there, her frail body still and quiet, but her breathing was labored. The beeping of the heart monitor was steady, but too slow for my liking. Something was wrong. Her condition had deteriorated rapidly since that morning, much faster than it should have. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning her chart. The medication she'd been given wasn't right. I'd noticed the dosages before, but now it was clear they had been adjusted, changed subtly, but enough to make her weaker. My stomach twisted. I had been right all along. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Elena stepped inside, her face pale with worry. "Ava," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "I thought you might be here." "Elena, I think they've been manipulating her treatment," I said, my voice low but urgent. "Look at this." I pointed to the chart. "The dosage. This isn't what she should be getting. They're making her worse." Elena's eyes widened, and she quickly scanned the chart, her brow furrowing in confusion. This can't be right. It's like they're deliberately." "They are," I cut in. I'd overheard Ivanov and Clara talking earlier. "They're keeping her family away for a reason. They're after something, but I don't know what." Elena's hand flew to her mouth, shock and fear mingling in her expression. "What do we do? If you report this, they'll bury it. You know they will. Ivanov has too much influence here." I paused, my mind racing. Reporting it to the hospital board was pointless. Ivanov had connections everywhere. If I went down that path, I'd be risking my job, and possibly more. "We need proof," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "If we can get concrete evidence, something they can't deny, then we'll have a chance." Elena nodded slowly, though I could see the fear flickering in her eyes. "But how?" "They're careful, Ava. They won't leave anything in the open." I thought for a moment, my gaze flickering to Mrs. Lebedev. Her records, her treatment logs, they must be altering them. If we can access the original files before they're modified, it might be enough. Elena hesitated. "That would mean breaking into the secure record system." "That's risky, Ava. If we get caught." "I know the risks," I said firmly. "But this isn't just about me or my job anymore. It's about her." I gestured toward the frail woman in the bed. "She doesn't have much time left. If we don't act now, it'll be too late." Elena sighed, rubbing her forehead. "Okay, I'm in, but we need to be smart about this." I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. Most of the administrative staff had already gone home, and the IT department wouldn't be back until morning. "Now's our best chance," I said. "We'll need to move quickly." Elena nodded, her expression resolute. "Lead the way." We moved through the hospital like shadows, careful not to attract attention. The server room, where the medical records were kept, was located in a restricted area near the administrative wing. As we approached the door, Elena pulled out a small ID badge she'd borrowed from one of the senior nurses earlier. "Let's hope this works," she whispered, sliding the card through the reader. The light blinked green, and the door clicked open. I exhaled in relief, pushing the door open just enough for us to slip inside. The room was dimly lit, rows of computers humming softly in the background. My heart raced as we approached the main terminal. This was it, the moment that would either save Mrs. Lebedev or condemn her to whatever plan Ivanov and Clara had put into motion. Elena sat at the terminal, quickly typing in her credentials. The screen flickered to life, and she began navigating through the system with practiced ease. "Here," she said after a few tense minutes. I found her records. I leaned over her shoulder, my eyes scanning the screen. Everything looked normal at first glance. Her medical history, treatment plans, notes from the attending doctors. But then I saw it, the discrepancies in the dosages, the changes in her medication that hadn't been logged anywhere else. "This is it," I whispered. "This is the proof we need." Elena nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she downloaded the files. "I'll copy everything. We'll need to make sure we have backups in case they try to erase it." Just as she finished, the door behind us creaked open. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. Dr. Ivanov stood in the doorway, his eyes cold and calculating. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was low, dangerous. For a split second, panic gripped me, but then I straightened, meeting his gaze with defiance. "We know what you've been doing," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at me. "We have proof. You've been altering Mrs. Lebedev's treatment to weaken her, and you've kept her family away for a reason. Whatever you're after, it ends now." Ivanov's lips curled into a sinister smile, and he stepped closer, his presence menacing. "You really think you can stop me, Ava? You have no idea how deep this goes. You're just a nurse, you're expendable." My heart pounded, but I stood my ground. "I won't let you get away with this, not anymore." Ivanov's smile faded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, anger, maybe even fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the door behind him swung open again. It was Alina, and she wasn't alone. "I've already called security," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They're on their way." Ivanov's expression darkened, but he said nothing. For a moment, we stood in silence, the tension thick in the air. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. As the door clicked shut behind him, I finally let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding.